Should I buy Bitcoin? The age-old question of the past 10 years. Let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages. Welcome back to Life-Changing Wealth. You know who it is. It's your boy, Jay Biondo here today, and we're going to talk about Bitcoin. What are the advantages and disadvantages of buying Bitcoin? You know, a lot of times, if you've been in the crypto space for quite a while, the automatic assumption is that you should buy Bitcoin. That should not be an automatic, because anytime I make any investment, Bitcoin, equities, just look at money in general, outside of an asset class even, you know, there's always people running around. I've got family members asking me all the time, hey, should I buy Bitcoin? And my response really is, well, compared to what? Because you always have to make comparisons when you're thinking about doing investing and what the risks are kind of in parallel with the other asset that you're considering, right? Because it's not an automatic, right? Because if you were to say, well, should I buy Bitcoin? And somebody just says yes, and then they invested at the same time, sometime last year in January or a little bit later, right? When Shiba came out, they had the option to invest in Shiba Inu. They would have been a lot better if they invested in Shiba. Now, I'm not an advocate for Shiba. They would have been better off in terms of their return on investment had they invested in Cardano even, right? So these are things that you have to consider, is that the answer is not always clear. Should I buy Bitcoin? We're going to take a deeper dive into this, into some of the things that you have to consider when you're trading. They go beyond just like a black and white answer of should you buy or shouldn't you buy. I'm going to rip this shit apart. We're going to talk about it. But first, before I rip this shit to shreds, let's take a look at the charts. All right, here we are, guys. I just wanted to pull up TradingView, and I wanted to illustrate a point here, and that is right now when we look at Bitcoin in the short term. This is the monthly candle, so this is pretty zoomed out. This is a pretty macro view. And I wanted to do this just to provide a framework of what's really happening with Bitcoin over the long term. So when we look at this in the short term, you know, if we were to zoom in, let's just go to the daily, right, real quick. We'll zoom back out in a second. But you know, if we were to look over here and somebody was to ask me in the real short term, should I buy Bitcoin? And I were to say yes, then it started to dip, you know, which would have been, if we look at this is not just it's a fairly small move in terms of Bitcoin, but had they only been in equities, this is a large move. This is a 16% dip. Now, if you've been in the crypto world for a while, you know that this is certainly nothing to be concerned about. So you have to zoom out. You have to really look at this from even a wider net. Now, obviously, you zoom out, you look at this, you say, well, oh man, had I invested in 2016, I would be up a whopping, oh my gosh, 15,000% right now. It sounds like a no-brainer, right? And it usually is, but it's all respective to what your time horizon is, because had you purchased somewhere, let's say December of 17 at the high, and you would have come down to, let's say this is an 80% drop over that, an 83% or so drop. And had you sold out of fear, it would not have been such a good idea to buy Bitcoin, right? So it's not always clear. The timing of this is really dependent on what your time horizon is. Whether you're a short-term investor, a long-term investor, all these things matter when you really have to consider, should you buy Bitcoin or not? The other thing you have to ask yourself is really compared to what, right? Because there are times when it makes sense to hold Bitcoin if we think the market is going to move to a more Bitcoin-centric approach or a Bitcoin bullish scenario, which does happen when we see Bitcoin dominance go up. Okay, so here is the Bitcoin dominance. I'm going to just pull it up real quick. Here it is. I want to illustrate another point. So, okay, when we look at this, right, sometimes it makes sense to be in Bitcoin when we see the Bitcoin dominance start to rally back up. But other times when we see these dips drop down, it makes more sense to be in altcoins, right? So that's something you also have to consider moving forward with your investments. And another thing is you always have to consider what your risk level is, okay? Even outside of the charts, this is just sort of an illustration of the charts, but you have to ask yourself what your risk tolerance is and other assets that are similar to it. So that's what I wanted to illustrate on the charts, but I also want to just talk about, you're always comparing it to things. So when you look at bonds, typically, if you look at government bonds, you're looking at low yields to negative yields. When you are looking at equities, you're typically in the past 100 years looking at a 10% return. Although lately, with all the money printing now, we're getting the past couple years now about a 20% return, or so it seems. But inflation is starting to hedge that. So Bitcoin being a new asset class, or cryptos in general being a new asset class, it's becoming attractive because it's also an inflation hedge. So these are things you have to consider. But it's all, as I just explained, that chain of different assets you could hold, the volatility increases, right? So the greater potential return, the greater potential risk that you have to be able to handle. And it's not always easy to handle it. So it is something you have to consider when setting up a portfolio, right? I don't think this is not financial advice, but I really don't think you should be invested solely in Bitcoin or solely in anything. I don't believe in taking a deterministic approach when it comes to investing. That is very important to keep top of mind, because that is how you get screwed. That is how you lose your whole bag that you've saved up for, right? That is really important to somewhat diversify, even if you're not heavily diversified, at least to diversify asset classes to hedge some of your risk, right? Real important to do that. I can't stress that enough. So the question, should you buy Bitcoin? Not always so clear. There are times when you should. There are times when you shouldn't. There are times in the market, which we're kind of experiencing right now, when you really have to ask yourself, well, if the market goes up, I think Bitcoin's going to be the next bull to run, even more than altcoins. And that makes sense. So then, okay, maybe I should buy Bitcoin rather than alts. Again, comparison, right? Rather than alts. Not necessarily rather than my equities. And then the other thing you have to consider, well, if Bitcoin were to drop in value, would I rather be in Bitcoin or alts? Well, yeah, I'd probably rather be in Bitcoin because my alts are going to get wrecked. So that is something you have to consider. These are moving targets. A lot of times you'll hear people say you should just put 50% of your portfolio in Bitcoin, use that as your portfolio strategy. You'll hear this around a lot of the investment circles online. I don't necessarily subscribe to that approach. I don't think it's a bad thing to hold Bitcoin for me, but I don't necessarily prescribe to those ratios that people throw out. I think it's really an individual basis, how much risk you're willing to tolerate. All of that stuff is, stuff you have to consider when making the choice, should you buy Bitcoin? Other than that, guys, that's what I wanted to leave you with. And that's what I really wanted you to know about investing in general. The question is not so clear. It's not so simple as, should I buy this? Should I buy that? If it was, there would be no need for financial advisors and for people to help you plan out your wealth in your portfolio. So consider those things as you make investment choices, especially if you're new to investing. You really have to think about that. It's always a comparison. It's always relative to different ratios and how much you should diversify and what your risk tolerance is and what your goals are and what you would consider success. Those are all things you have to take into consideration whether or not you should buy Bitcoin or not. That's it for today. I wanted to just make sure I hammered that point home. I hope to see you guys in my other videos, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.